message I have to share with you today is actually one that's quite painful for me to deliver. I'm very accustomed to public speaking, yet you'll hear throughout my talk the reason for that. Confronting the opioid crisis, and what I want to do is ask a couple questions and begin to give you some information about the opioid crisis. First of all, what is it? Second, why will 60,000 people die in the United States this year? More people will die this year from this condition than all that died in the history of the war in Vietnam. You can take any NFL football stadium in America today, fill it to capacity, and kill everyone off in 5 minutes. That's the quality and the quantity of the effect and the magnitude of the opioid crisis. And it's why our president has recently and wisely weighed in on this, declaring it a national emergency. And finally, what are some possible solutions to this very complex problem? And I'm going to provide you with 8 possible things that can be done, only one of which involves the government. So I want to present this to you, though, from 3 perspectives. I'm uniquely suited to address all 3 of these: the personal, the professional, and the pastoral perspectives. I'm bivocational. I work in the pharmaceutical industry as an inventor and an entrepreneur, but I'm also the leader of a Christian ministry, and my family has suffered greatly because of this. So let's first look at what is the opioid crisis, and I want to show you the face of it. This is my son Thomas. He died on February the 2nd in the basement of our home. I was the dad who discovered his cold, lifeless body sitting in a chair, having overdosed from heroin and fentanyl. My son was a lovely young man, bright, creative. And when he reached a young age, adolescent transition of about age 12, he began to experience acute anxiety, which manifested as obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. Went to see a psychiatrist, and as a result of that, was immediately placed on the benzodiazepine class of drugs, things like Xanax and Klonopin and Ativan, and that class of anti-anxiety medicines, and it messed my son's life up forever. Shown here on the upper left, the little boy, he's shown there with his mother, Laura, my wife, of 36 years. And below, he's shown with his siblings at his brother's wedding in Kansas City. And on the far right was taken in New York City weeks before his death. So what happened to my son? Why is he one of the 60,000 fatalities this year? It started as a mental health problem. As an adolescent, he had OCD. The psychiatrist then prescribed benzodiazepines along with other mental health drugs, SSRIs and others. The side effects of the benzodiazepines turned him into a zombie. He would go to school, and for 5 periods, he would rest his head on his forearm on his desk. He was not awake. His mind was impaired as a result of it. And then years later, towards the end of high school, he went to an oral surgeon, had his wisdom teeth removed, and as a result of that was treated then for his pain symptoms by an opioid pain medication. There are many, for instance, like Percocet. And that day, and I did not know this until the end of his life, but he told me, he said, "Dad, the first time I tried an opiate pain medication, that was the first time I ever felt normal in my life as a young man." The euphoria produced by an opioid is the driver of the crisis. The high and the euphoria is it. And for a lot of people affected by mental health disorders, once they've encountered an opioid and the high of an opioid, it's very difficult to take your foot off that accelerator. He then transitioned from prescription opioids to street opioids, and as I said, he died of a heroin fentanyl overdose in our home. This opioid crisis is the fastest way to kill a young kid. The very first time they try it, they'll die. This isn't lightweight. I'm going to go have 2 beers and Budweiser behind the stadium. The first time you try it, you can die from it. Next, we also have recovery and addiction programs, and I want to tell you a little more about what I think is the best way of undergoing recovery, and I'll mention that later. There are all kinds of ways to do it. There are medical approaches, there's Suboxone and methadone clinics, but there are also counseling sessions and psychiatrists and psychologists. But I believe the best way to address the problem are faith-based initiatives, and I'll mention that later. Then we have the problem of the suppliers. The reason people are dying today is not the heroin crisis of the 1960s and 70s that affected Skid Row. It's not the same drug crisis. What it is today is ultra-potent opioids have made it onto the marketplace, things like fentanyl, that require no more than the equivalent of 2 grains of salt to kill you. If you can see that dose, barely to see it with your eyeball, it's enough to kill you, of fentanyl. It's 50 times more potent than any of the precursor drugs that the drugs are made from. It's extremely potent. And most of that is coming out of China. So the synthetic derivatives are coming from China. Another problem is access to information. Young kids with smartphones know how to get drugs. And they know very well how to get it. They know how to interface with the dark web. And the dark web may not be known to many of us, but fortunately Jeff Sessions has put his thumb on this as a key issue for the Justice Department. The dark web is a hellhole where you can go to buy drugs illegally and have it shipped through the mail to your home. And then the last issue is justice and incarceration, and as far as I'm concerned, it's already too late. When you hit justice and incarceration and the overdose deaths, it's the end of the road. We need to solve the problems on all those other points leading up to it. So there are a series of addictive substances that are out there, but I'm going to highlight 2 of them. We have the opioids on the left, things like hydrocodone or heroin or fentanyl, and on the right, the benzodiazepine drugs to treat anxiety. So what about the connection to the mental health aspects? First of all, mental health disorders such as anxiety increase the likelihood of prescription opioid use. Adults with mental health disorders receive half of all opioid prescriptions. This should be a shocking number. Half of all the prescriptions go to the people who probably have anxiety. Whereas normal people, if you look at the ratio below, folks who are considered normal, only 5% of them that lack mental health disorders are on opioids. 18.7% of those who have mental health disorders are. So the problem is the standard of care drugs to treat anxiety are the benzodiazepines, and they have problems such as addiction. So what is the problem on the street? What does it look like to the high school kid, the college kid? First of all, they're high-potency synthetic opioids. Fentanyl is 50 times more potent than morphine. Carfentanil is 10,000 times more potent. If it takes 2 grains of salt equivalent of fentanyl to kill you, you don't even have to see carfentanil to kill you. One of the things I've personally done in this industry, I'm a product discoverer and development scientist. I have patents in this field. I've invented a new class of medicines to replace the benzodiazepines with something that should, in fact, be non-addicting, and the product is, in fact, called Panex. I started this work because of the pain of watching what happened in my son's life that began on the benzodiazepines when he was 12 years old, and God then breathed this invention into me, which I now own 3 U.S. patents on, and it truly is the first fast-acting and effective way of treating acute anxiety episodes without using any addictive substances. So this is a God-breathed intervention that's redemptive of the pain that my son suffered. So in the third area, let's look at the pastoral aspect. I have the privilege of every Wednesday I volunteer at a place called the Lovelady Center in Birmingham, Alabama. Hollywood is making a film about this place right now. It is the largest faith-based drug recovery center in the United States. And every Wednesday, I get to go be a broken-hearted, teary-eyed dad with 400 young women, 80% of which have had exposure to opioids in their lives. They've had overdose deaths of their husbands, their brothers, their mothers, their children. I've had women come up to me on a routine basis every single week for 4 months, and they come telling me their stories of who died in their family from this. every single week. And I then teach them, I love on them, I pray for them, and I get to know them and their situation. But this is a model recovery center, and here are the reasons why. It was led by a woman named Brenda Spann. You can get her book. It's called Miss Brenda and the Love Ladies. They have 400 women in residence there. It is a whole way house. It is holistic. This is not just a medical clinic that gives you Suboxone or gives you methadone. It's the whole way. The goal of this ministry is to present you back to life whole and fit and ready to resume life. It's not sobriety. Sobriety is the afterthought. We don't teach sobriety. We actually inform the ladies we're giving you life skills and we're going to turn you into the woman and the mother you want to be. So we do worship, prayer, biblical teaching, counseling. We provide medical assistance on site. And every one of the women who goes through the program is required to be like an intern working a job. They have to work. They have to understand life skills. They have to go work 8 hours a day. And so that's one of the keys is to re-empowering these women. It's a 9-month program at which point they can graduate. And by doing so, hope then is imparted. Next, I want to tell you the 8 suggestions I have for things that can be done that we at a grassroots level can implement that don't require government intervention in order to see solutions brought to the table. First of all, drug companies and entrepreneurs need to invent new, moderate to severe pain medicines that are alternatives to opiates. This is a field where the industry gave up doing research on this. They came to a point where they said tramadol's great and morphine's great and fentanyl's great, and they just said, okay, we like Lortabs and we like Percocet and Endocet, and they just sort of said, okay, we've maxed out, we've got everything covered there. We need to re-engage basic science all the way through commercial development of new drugs, one of which is ketamine that is being revived and revitalized and revisited in this space. The second of all, we need non-addicting anxiety medicines, an example of which is Panax, which I've had the privilege of working on, and I'm in the process of moving our business forward. Third, we need to understand the value of Naloxone, Narcan, and we need to make that broadly available to families where those heroin addicts and those fentanyl addicts are so that we can keep them alive, so that we can get them into some kind of a recovery. This is a real serious matter, and you're hearing a lot in the news about it, but access to Naloxone will save your life if it's given at the right time. Number 4, we need faith-based residential recovery centers, and I can tell you this, for years I appealed to my son Thomas, asking him to go into a residential treatment center. He refused to do so. My son did, in fact, once the final 3 months of his life, he was clean. He actually was clean for 3 months, and during that time he was going to Narcotics Anonymous, which is a 12-step process, and I'd say it's better than doing nothing. At least he was engaging and doing something. But 2 days before he died, he had been hospitalized. He had a problem with his esophagus. He had pneumonia. He was very sick, and I took him to the hospital. He came away from there back on a tramadol medicine. Tramadol is an opiate. And I warned him that day. I said, son, this is a slippery slope. You're the last kid in the world because of your past that needs to be on tramadol. Tramadol is an opiate. And what it did was it re-engaged his thought processes towards euphoria. And a few days later, he called up his idiot friends on the street and said, hook me up. I'm going back to the street. Get me some heroin for my pain. My son died 2 days later. And that kid who hooked him up and did that had the nerve and the audacity. After I forgave him, within 24 hours of my son's death, I'd already forgiven that kid over the phone. I said, I already know you're culpable. And I forgave him. I said, because I have a deep well of forgiveness in me. Jesus has forgiven me. I forgive you. And that kid had the nerve to call me up months later and cussed me out and said, you're the reason your son died, not me. I'm not culpable. And having admitted that he was the one that arranged the phone call for the heroin dealer, took him there and bought it. And yet, this is the sociopathic, selfish behavior of these drug dealers today. They cannot see anything other than their next high, and they will sacrifice anything, family, friends, money, or anything to get there. Number 5, counseling. We do need counseling. And I'm a firm believer that whatever counseling you get, it would certainly be good if it's faith-based. But if you can't get that, then take the second best. And if that's a psychiatrist or typically it'd be a psychologist, get it. and deal with the root order problems that are driving your mental health problems. I can tell you this, of the women that I deal with, and I see so many women every week, 80% of those women had trauma of their past, and the trauma of their past drove them to mental health problems that ultimately drove them to opiates. Number 6, parental authority. There's a problem with HIPAA regulations. It makes it very difficult to be a parent of a kid who has a mental health disorder or is a drug addict to be actively engaged in their care. That is the one issue, point number 6, where the government piece needs to be addressed. I don't know how to do it, I'm just saying it needs to be. It's your hands are tied behind your back if you're a parent of a kid who's a drug addict. Number 7, we need to limit the access to the supply, and that would be the Department of Justice, the Post Office, Customs and Border Patrol. And number 7, this is to counter the bad information. We need more men, women that are out there that are willing to stand up and tell kids, particularly high school and college kids, of the dangers of the opioid crisis. And thank you for your time.